Well, the Australia decision there is hugely embarrassing. It's humiliating for Invictus and Harry, and I don't think any attempt to kind of spin it in any other way is going to work.
$63 million. That is what passed through the Invictus Games structure for the Vancouver Games. Um, and the figure that reportedly reached the veterans, the people those games were built to serve, according to financial observers who reviewed the publicly available accounts, somewhere in the region of $200,000. That is not a rounding error. That is not an accounting quirk. That gap between 63 million raised and 200,000 delivered is the number nobody on that panel said out loud. Over the next 20 minutes, we are walking through the full picture, the money trail, the timeline, and the pattern that was already visible before anyone in mainstream media decided to look at it. By the end, you will understand why Australia didn't pull that funding by accident and why, if you have been paying attention, none of this is actually a surprise. If $200,000 out of 63 million sounds off to you, good. You are paying attention. Stay with us. But before we get into the numbers, we need to establish something about the people who have been telling this story publicly. Because Matt Wilkinson is not a pundit who reaches for dramatic language. That matters here. Wilkinson is a royal reporter for The Sun who was filing live from Reggio Emilia, Italy, when the Australian news broke during the episode we opened with. He covers this beat closely. He was in a good mood that day, reporting on a genuinely significant moment for the Princess of Wales. And then the news came through. And even in the middle of that, even while he was halfway across Europe covering something entirely different, his reaction to the Invictus announcement was immediate and unambiguous. He called it hugely embarrassing. He called it humiliating for Invictus and Harry. And he said on camera that no attempt to spin it in any other way was going to work. Now, his colleague Jack Royston, who covers the royal beat for Newsweek, went a step further. He called Australia the first domino to tumble. He laid out the structural problem clearly. Fewer active conflicts mean fewer new veterans entering the Invictus pipeline, which makes the financial sustainability question harder to ignore with each passing year. Royston's point about the pipeline was well taken, but he was wrong about one thing. Um, Australia was not the first domino, it was the second. And that detail, the one nobody corrected him on, changes what you are looking at entirely. We will get to the first one in a moment. But first, consider what it means that two experienced royal correspondents, one of them live on the ground in Italy, reacted to this news with the word humiliating and moved on within minutes. Because what the word humiliating does is close a conversation, it assigns an emotion and pivots. What the word humiliating does not do is ask. Humiliating because of what exactly? What are the numbers? Where did the money go? Those are the questions the comment sections were asking. The panel was not. A viewer commenting under that same Royal Exclusive episode, writing within hours of it going live, put it directly. The question with 62 likes was straightforward. How much money from the Invictus Games is actually getting to the wounded soldiers for their rehab? Another comment landing at 83 likes pointed to independent research already underway into exactly that question, noting that the costs were enormous and the benefits by comparison were slim. The audience was already ahead of the story. The journalists were still on the word humiliating. Now, here is the piece Royston missed. Germany hosted Invictus Games. They ran, they concluded, and after Dusseldorf, Germany's relationship with the Invictus hosting structure did not continue in the direction that had originally been discussed. The departure was quiet. There was no statement from the foundation, no coverage in British royal media worth mentioning, no acknowledgement that one of the participating nations had effectively stepped back from the orbit of the Games. A viewer watching that royal exclusive episode flagged it in the comments. The note at 74 likes was direct. Was Australia actually the second country to bow out, not the first? Didn't Germany quit after Dusseldorf? And if so, why did nobody say so at the time? It is a reasonable question. It is also, according to those who tracked the Dusseldorf exit, a question the Invictus Foundation never felt the need to answer publicly. Which brings us to something worth sitting with for a moment. The difference between calling something the first domino and calling it the second is not cosmetic. If Australia is the first, you have an isolated event. A budget decision in a difficult fiscal year, understandable, maybe even forgivable. If Australia is the second, you have a pattern. And patterns, as you are about to see, are what this story is actually about. Longtime observers tracking the governance of the Invictus Foundation have noted, according to reports, that the questions raised after the Dusseldorf experience were never fully addressed before Vancouver was announced. The structural questions about how money flows through the foundation, about what percentage reaches athletes and families versus what gets absorbed by operations, were present before Australia made its decision. They were simply not being asked in the places where they would have been noticed. These are claims based on publicly available reporting, not confirmed by the Invictus Foundation itself. We are laying out what has been documented. You decide what it means. What we can say is this: the pattern of quiet institutional withdrawal, followed eventually by a louder one, is consistent with confidence eroding gradually rather than suddenly. Germany went quietly, nobody noticed. Um, and so the conditions for a second departure were already in place because the first one produced no accountability, no review, no public reckoning. Australia did not go quietly. And now, finally, people are asking the questions that should have been asked after Dusseldorf. Meanwhile, let us talk about the money Australia was actually giving, because the panel said the funding was cut. What they did not say was what that funding looked like up close. The Australian government's annual contribution to Invictus Australia was, according to figures cited by those who reviewed the federal budget documentation, in the region of $3 million per year. Paula Froelich, entertainment director at News Nation, who has reported on Invictus Foundation finances alongside independent researchers, noted figures suggesting that of that $3 million, approximately $2.17 million went directly to employee expenses, not to veteran programming, not to athlete support, not to rehabilitation services, to wages. That is 72% of the Australian government's annual contribution going to salaries before a single veteran saw a benefit. And yet the panel's word was humiliating. Not where did 72% of that money go? Not who was being paid and for what. Just humiliating. Moving on. The structural question underneath that number is not complicated. If an organization receives $3 million from a government specifically to support veterans, and $2 million of that goes to running the organization itself, the government funding the organization is not funding veterans. It is funding the organization. At some point, a government doing basic arithmetic on its own budget line will notice that distinction. Australia noticed. Beyond that, the Vancouver picture is considerably harder to explain away. $63 million passed through the Invictus Games structure for the 2025 Vancouver Games. That figure has been cited in independent analysis of the foundation's accounts by researchers who reviewed the publicly available documentation. The veteran-facing spend, the portion that directly reached the competitors and their families, has been reported in that same analysis at approximately $200,000, less than 1%. You do not need to be an accountant to find that ratio striking. You need to be able to read two numbers next to each other. It is possible, of course, that large international sporting events carry substantial operational costs that have nothing to do with mismanagement. Venues, logistics, security, staffing. These things are not trivial, and anyone who has organized an event at scale understands that the headline number and the net program spend are rarely the same figure. That is a reasonable point. Still, for an organization whose founding mission is explicitly the rehabilitation and recognition of wounded veterans, and whose primary public voice has consistently framed Invictus as a vehicle for healing rather than a commercial or logistical exercise, the distance between 63 million and 200,000 is not a gap you close with overhead explanations. It is a gap that requires a line by line accounting, one the Invictus Foundation has not, as of this recording, voluntarily provided. Now, there is something about the Invictus financial structure that most royal commentary simply does not engage with. The actual paperwork, the numbers on file with the charitable regulators in the jurisdictions where the foundation operates, not the press releases, not the speeches on stage in Vancouver with the flags and the athletes and the cameras. The documents. The Invictus Games Foundation operates as a registered charitable entity. That means its finances are subject to public disclosure requirements in at least some of the jurisdictions where it functions. And what those disclosures show, according to researchers who have reviewed them, raises questions that go well beyond whether one government chose to reallocate a budget line in a difficult fiscal year. Harry and Meghan attended the Vancouver Games. Their travel, accommodation, and related expenses moved through the foundation structure. The foundation has not published a granular breakdown of individual line items covering those costs. What has been published in the broad strokes disclosures available does not reconcile easily with the narrative that Invictus is primarily a program for veterans rather than a platform for its most prominent patrons. Documents do not lie the way press releases do. And these documents are not telling the same story the Invictus spokespeople have been telling for years. Why is there no line by line accounting? Not a suggested one, not a promised one, not one described in an interview, an actual published document showing where $63 million went and how much of it landed with the people Invictus was built for. That question has been sitting in the public record since Vancouver. The foundation has not answered it. This is one interpretation of publicly available data, not a confirmed audit. The full picture may differ from what has been cited in these reports. Angela Levin, who wrote a biography of Harry in 2018 and has followed his public work in detail since, has observed in subsequent commentary that Invictus was always the one project Harry could credibly call his own. The one legacy that did not depend on his royal title, his proximity to the palace, or Meghan's brand strategy. The one thing that was genuinely his, built on something real, which makes what is happening now considerably more significant than a budget line getting cut in Canberra. Because if Invictus was Harry's one untouchable thing, the thing that would outlast the Netflix deal and the memoir and the rest of it, then the financial questions now surrounding it are not just an institutional problem. They are a personal one. And the next city on the calendar is Birmingham. Birmingham City Council is not, as Matt Wilkinson noted in the same episode, awash with money. There have been bin strikes. There has been documented fiscal distress at the council level. And yet Birmingham is scheduled to host the Invictus Games next year. Whoever is covering the cost of that event, whether it is the UK government, private sponsors, or some arrangement not yet publicly disclosed, will be making that decision with the full context of Vancouver and Australia already on the record. If Australia looked at the books and left, what exactly is Birmingham going to find when it does the same calculation? The departures did not stop with governments. Consider what else has happened around Invictus in the same window, quietly, with no coverage in the mainstream royal press. Boeing was a major Invictus sponsor. Boeing withdrew that sponsorship ahead of Birmingham. The Invictus Foundation offered no public explanation. Boeing offered no public explanation. The withdrawal was simply noted in the places where it was noted at all, and the story moved on. A corporate sponsor of that scale does not walk away from a high-profile charitable event without a reason. The reason has not been made public. What is public is that they left. Melanie Poole held the position of trustee and vice chairman of the Invictus Games board. Melanie Poole resigned that position mid-term without a public statement explaining the decision, without coverage in the mainstream royal commentary channels that spent considerable airtime on the Australia announcement. A vice chairman and trustee departing mid-term is not routine board turnover. It is a signal. The question is what it is signaling. Commentators who have followed the governance of the Invictus Foundation over time have suggested, according to reports, that this sequence, quiet departures followed eventually by a louder one, is consistent with institutional confidence eroding gradually from the inside before it becomes visible from the outside. The Germany exit produced no accountability, so the conditions for further erosion remain in place. Vancouver happened. The financial ratio it produced was not addressed publicly. And then Australia loudly did what Germany had done quietly 18 months earlier. The pattern keeps repeating. Same shape, different scale. It is possible each of these departures has an innocent explanation. A government tightening its budget, a corporation reviewing its sponsorship portfolio, a board member pursuing other interests. There are ordinary explanations for all of it. The trouble is that ordinary explanations, when they arrive in sequence at the same institution in the same direction, start to look less like coincidence and more like a verdict being delivered one departure at a time. Now, Harry was reportedly blindsided by the Australia announcement. That word blindsided came from sources close to him, as reported by Jack Royston in the same episode. The organization in Australia was reportedly blindsided as well. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody had warning, which is a remarkable thing to say about a government that had just watched Harry and Meghan conduct a high profile visit to Australia, in part to reinforce the Invictus relationship there. The Australian government watched that visit. The Australian government then cut the funding. Whatever the tour was meant to communicate, it reportedly communicated something different to the people making the budget decisions in Canberra. If the visit was meant to solidify support, what exactly did it solidify? Five pieces: Germany, Vancouver, Boeing, Poole, Australia, same direction, same silence from the foundation after each one, and a sixth piece already forming in a city that, by its own public financial record, is struggling to deliver basic municipal services. Comments under the Royal Exclusive episode where this news broke tell their own story. The top reply, with over 80 likes at the time of recording, pointed to independent financial research already underway into the Invictus accounts, noting that the costs were enormous and the returns for veterans were slim. Directly underneath it, another viewer asked the question that should have been the panel's first question: how much of the Invictus money is actually reaching the soldiers it exists to serve? 62 likes on that one from a YouTube comment section on a mainstream royal show. That question with those likes tells you where the audience already was. It tells you what people watching that panel already suspected and were not hearing addressed. A viewer identifying as Australian put it plainly: the government had made the right call. The doubts about how Invictus money was being used were, in that viewer's words, legitimate. Another noted the specific wage figure, the 2 million plus being absorbed by employee expenses out of a 3 to million annual contribution, and drew the conclusion directly. A third pointed to the Vancouver numbers: $200,000 to veterans, 63 million total. The arithmetic does not require explanation. These are not fringe accounts. These are the most engaged responses on a video about a breaking news story. The audience was already running the numbers. The journalists had moved on to the next segment. Here is what we keep coming back to when we look at the Invictus story across the last 3 years. The problem is not one government cutting a grant. The problem is not one sponsor departing. The problem is not one board member stepping down. The problem is that every single one of these things follows the same shape, and the organization at the center of that shape has never once addressed the financial structure in public with actual numbers. Not with a breakdown, not with an audit, not with a line by line account of where $63 million went, with press releases, with photographs, with Harry on stage talking about courage and resilience and the extraordinary spirit of the competitors, all of which may be genuine, none of which answers the question. We are not saying the work is without value. The athletes are real. The rehabilitation is real. The need is real. What we are saying is that the gap between the narrative and the numbers has been growing for long enough that it deserves more than the word humiliating and a pivot to the next topic. This is not a new dynamic in the landscape of celebrity attached charitable organizations. The pattern of a prominent figure lending their name to a cause, and the cause gradually shifting its center of gravity from the people it serves toward the people who represent it, has a documented history. The Lance Armstrong Foundation eventually became more about Lance Armstrong than about cancer research. The Clinton Global Initiative faced serious questions about what percentage of its intake reached program services versus operational overhead. Neither comparison implies fraud. What both comparisons illustrate is that the organizational conditions which produce this kind of financial drift are well understood. The warning signs are consistent: major funders exiting quietly, governance departures without explanation, financial disclosures that raise more questions than they answer. Those warning signs are present here, in sequence, in the same order they have appeared in previous versions of this story. Which brings us back to Birmingham. 1 year from now, Invictus is scheduled to arrive in a city with a documented fiscal crisis. Whoever is covering that cost will be making their decision with Vancouver's ratio and Australia's exit already in the design list. The financial questions are no longer coming from skeptical comment sections. They are coming from governments that have reviewed the numbers and made a choice. The question is not whether those questions will be asked in Birmingham. The question is who answers them and whether the answer is any different from the silence that followed Germany and Vancouver and Boeing and Poole. Not every departure here is damning on its own. And yet, when they arrive in sequence with no public response from the foundation, no financial disclosure, no accountability statement addressing the ratio between what is raised and what reaches veterans, the silence starts to carry its own weight. Patterns are not evidence, um, but they are worth noticing. And this one has been worth noticing for longer than most people have been paying attention. And that silence is exactly where we are going next. Through every link in this chain, one element has stayed identical. The silence from the Invictus Foundation, no statement addressing the financial ratio questions, no published breakdown of Vancouver's spend, no explanation for the Boeing departure, no comment on the Poole resignation, no response to the Australia decision beyond the single word blindsided. Blindsided. That was the word. Not here are the numbers. Not here is what the money was spent on. Not here is the audit that shows our veteran facing spend. Blindsided, as though the problem was the timing of the announcement rather than the content of the question the announcement was implicitly asking. An organization that had clean answers to the financial questions being raised would have, in the normal course of events, provided them. The fact that it has not consistently across multiple events, multiple departures, multiple government decisions is itself a data point. What does an organization say when it has nothing useful to say? Apparently, it says blindsided and waits for the next segment. So let us lay it out. Just the publicly documented pieces in order. Germany hosted Invictus Games after Dusseldorf and did not continue in the hosting structure. No coverage, no explanation from the foundation. The first departure, and nobody said so. Vancouver raised $63 million. The veteran facing spend has been cited in independent analysis at approximately $200,000. Less than 1%. No line by line accounting has been published by the foundation. Boeing, a major Invictus sponsor, withdrew its sponsorship ahead of Birmingham. No public explanation from the foundation. No public explanation from Boeing. Melanie Poole, Invictus trustee and vice chairman, resigned her position midterm. No public statement. No coverage in the channels that spent considerable time on the Australia story. Australia cut its annual $3 million contribution, with reportedly 2.17 million of that going annually to employee expenses. Harry's camp described the decision as blindsiding. The Australian government did not elaborate further. 5 pieces, same direction, same non-response from the centre. Voices in the British press covering Sussex matters have observed, according to reports, that this sequence, quiet institutional departures followed by a public rupture, is consistent with organisational confidence eroding over time rather than collapsing suddenly. The erosion was already underway. Australia was where it became visible. None of this proves wrongdoing. We are connecting public dots, not making accusations. What is reported is not always what is true, and the full picture may differ from what these reports suggest. What we can say is that 5 data points, all public, all pointing in the same direction, with no substantive response from the organization they concern, form a shape that is becoming harder to look past. What does the 6th piece look like? If you have been watching the Invictus story and something has not been adding up, you were not wrong. The math has been public, the pattern has been public. What has not been public is anyone in mainstream royal coverage sitting down with the numbers and asking the questions the comment sections have been asking for months. Matt Wilkinson called it humiliating. He was right. It is humiliating, but humiliation is what you call something when you see the surface of it. What is underneath the surface in the documents, in the departures, in the silence, looks less like embarrassment and more like a structural problem that was always going to produce this outcome. The foundation was not blindsided by Australia. The foundation was blindsided by the fact that Australia said it out loud. Germany, Vancouver, Boeing, Poole, Australia, 5 pieces down, Birmingham is next, which is exactly what we want to hear your thinking on. If the Birmingham games go ahead as planned and the financial accountability questions that Australia, Germany, Boeing, and a departing trustee have all implicitly raised get no public answer before then, what do you think happens? Does another government pull its contribution quietly? Does a second major corporate sponsor follow Boeing out the door? Or does the foundation find a way to get ahead of this publicly before the cameras arrive in Birmingham next year? I am genuinely curious what you have seen or heard that we have not covered here. If you have been following the independent financial research into the Invictus accounts, or if you have looked at the foundation's own disclosures yourself, leave it in the comments. We read them. Everyone, if this kind of breakdown is what you have been looking for in royal coverage, the actual numbers behind the narrative rather than just the narrative itself, the like button helps more than you might expect. It tells the algorithm that this kind of analysis is worth showing to more people. And subscribing means you will catch the next one before the story moves on. The next video is the other half of this week's picture. 300 Italian journalists applied for accreditation to cover the Princess of Wales in Reggio Emilia. 30 were admitted. What Catherine was actually doing there, the Reggio Emilia education framework, the Global Alliance, the palace used the word global 6 times in one briefing to describe and why this trip matters beyond the headlines, gets its own full breakdown. That is the next video. It will be on screen when this one ends. 5 pieces down. One more already forming. The pattern was always there in the filings, in the departures, in the numbers nobody wanted to say out loud. The question now is simply whether anyone in a position to act on it is paying the same kind of attention you are. See you for the Italy breakdown.